Um, all right, thanks for coming, everyone, to the February 24th PSP replacement breakout session. I thought it might be useful to briefly go over the summary of the goals and requirements that we talked about last time, and just make sure everyone's on the same page, and then pivot to talking about the actual implementations and proposals, which will take up the bulk of the time. So let me share my screen. Does anyone have anything to put on the agenda before, kind of before we just dive deep into the implementations? Is there anything that feels useful to cover before that? If not, it's fine. Okay, so I think I shared out this document. Let me make it bigger. How's that? I shared out this document about a week ago. Hopefully you had a chance to see it. But this is just my best effort to kind of capture and summarize all the different pieces that we talked about. So as a high-level objective, I think we all agree that the goal is to replace PodSecurityPolicy without compromising the ability to limit privilege escalation out of the box. Beyond that, things like minimizing attack surface or preventing denial of service attacks, I think those are nice to have, and we can kind of discuss them as we get into the implementation details, but at a high level, the goal is that short of a vulnerability, create or update pod does not equal root on cluster. And then the requirements that I think we, for the most part, had consensus on is that it is validating only, so no mutation. Safe to enable in new and upgraded clusters. Built-in in-tree controller as opposed to a webhook out of tree, although I am not ruling out the option to have a webhook as either something that can coexist alongside the in-tree one or as a way to prototype. That's beside the point. We at least need to, I think we had consensus on this. We need to have a path to a solution for Windows, even if it's not addressing Windows in the initial release. And I listed down in the contentious isn't quite the right word, but lacking consensus requirements is that it supports Windows in the initial release. Must handle API evolution across versions. Basically just means as we design the API, we should be thinking about how to have consistency as it evolves.
Just for clarity, is that the pod API? I think that's what you meant, but.
I guess I meant both the pod API or kind of the features that it covers, and also whatever API or user interface would be a better way of describing it. However we surface the feature to the user needs to be capable
pod API evolution and policy evolution.
Yeah.
Okay.
I kind of read this as being sort of your baby, Jordan, about how the PSP API sort of diverged like a river delta, and then like I understood this to be that that you and several other folks wanted to have a way to prevent the replacement API from from sort of going to seed the way that PSP did. And then I counter-argued that as long as the pod API goes to seed, any other API that tries to enforce things about it would have that same sort of challenge. And I think that's how it ended up in the like contentious requirements section. Like, I agree with that in principle, but I worry that there's nothing we can do to contain that complexity.
If we're looking at the requirements before we look at particular proposals for implementation, I missed the pun. What was the pun? Please tell me.
Can you contain that?
Oh, okay. Heaven forbid I miss a pun. If the thing we're wanting to protect is the pod API, then we need to be able to like have some approach to handling pod API evolution. If the solution to that is exposed as an API, then yes, that needs to be able to evolve as well. If it's not exposed as an API, but is sort of fixed policies, more like Tim's proposal, then we need to have a way to handle compatibility versioning evolution there, but it's not necessarily an API. I just wanted to, the thing we're trying to protect.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the pod, not just the API, but the features themselves, you know, what a pod is, we expect that to continue to evolve. And whatever solution we have needs to be prepared to deal with that evolution and not kind of fall apart the first time a new feature is added.
Yeah, I think if we frame the future Windows support in terms of being responsive to pod API evolution, then that becomes a lot simpler. Like I could imagine things that Windows would do in the future that would require a lot of configurability that I don't know that we would want to support. But if there's a field that Windows adds to the pod API, like the one that's being proposed now, like the host process field, like folding in a position about that field into future versions of this policy makes a lot of sense. So I think being responsible for pod API evolution covers a lot of ground.
I think I agree with you. I still like keeping Windows out as a separate requirement, just to be explicit about it.
Okay. Without being specific about what supporting Windows means, like that's if
that's
Windows,
where the word capable is doing a lot of lifting in R4.
Yeah. Okay.
Like no specific promises, but we do promise we're thinking about you.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe as we get deeper into the implementation, we can kind of come back to this. The last one, I marked this as fuzzy because it's hard to specify it as a requirement, but we want it to be easy to use. I think we all agree PodSecurityPolicy is not easy to use. But beyond that, this is where the kind of like red, yellow, green policy tier idea comes from, or ties in of you don't necessarily, I think we don't want you to need to understand the ins and outs of like what the no new pribs flag is and what the different capabilities expose in terms of attack surface. That you know, we can have the debate about whether we should surface those options at all, but whether or not those controls are surfaced, a user with kind of minimal understanding of those details should be able to apply this effectively. Okay, moving on to the non-consensus requirements. Exceptions or policy bindings by requesting user. This is about kind of punching holes through the policy for specific users. I think we also talked about for specific pods within a namespace. Actually, that might be a separate one on here, or runtime classes.
Runtime classes is further down.
Okay. Extensibility. You know, at the very base level, you kind of, no matter what we land on, you can always run a second admission controller as a webhook that will cover or layer on additional constraints on top of this. So that's kind of like the base level of extensibility or composability. This is more a question around like, do we want a way to plug in different runtime classes to have different types of policy enforcement around them or things like that? Windows support in the initial release, we already talked about. Support enforcement of at the sub namespace level. So yeah, being able to punch holes in the policy or apply a different set of policies to different pods within the same namespace. Enabled by default would certainly be nice, but we can talk about whether that's a requirement or not. Powerful and flexible enough for common enterprise use cases. This gets more into the kind of the discussion around flexibility. I guess this is just kind of getting at the key difference between the two proposals we were talking about. And providing an easy migration path from PodSecurityPolicy. In other words, how much do we want to deviate from the existing thing? Replacement. Nice to haves. I had put dry run policy changes, but there was some discussion around whether this is a requirement given that we want it to be safe to enable on upgraded clusters. So we could bump it up there. Audit only mode, sort of different from dry running policy changes. Dry run is around, at least the way I understood it when I wrote it, is if I dry run a policy change, I should be able to see what would break if I enabled this. And audit is enabling a policy in a non-enforcing mode.
Then I
So
guess N1 and N2 are like alternate ways that one could achieve R2?
Yeah. And enforcement on pod controller resources. So in other words, can I check my policy against replica sets and deployments and things like that? And then I think there were a couple open questions. The first one is around where kind of this idea of what's the philosophy of the policy, how do we decide what controls get in there and not, what fields are enforced and what aren't. A couple examples that were given were local denial of service mitigations, host ports, and readiness and liveness probes. What do we want to do about ephemeral containers? This came up in the last sig-auth, how we're going to handle those. Yeah, what we want to do with runtime policy, which relates also to punching holes in the policy and extensibility. Are there any questions about any of those, or does anyone feel like there's something that's missing?
Hey guys, I'd be tempted to suggest that N2 would be a requirement. I mean, that's going to make troubleshooting so much easier for folks when they're actually starting to use this. I see where like Tabitha was saying it could have use for N1 as well as in coming into, I think it was R2, but just purely from actually people onboarding and getting used to using the system, knowing why something broke is fairly important.
Yeah, I'm happy with adding one or both of those under as kind of subpoints under R2.
Yeah, I think the combination of R2 and R5, like safe, upgrade is safe, and adjusted policies can be applied safely. Audit and or dry run seem like the obvious mechanisms to use to do those safe upgrades. And
there could be a third option, but I don't know what it is. I haven't seen it before.
Right. So saying like audit or dry run, we know there are good use cases for those, or some yet unnamed other option which also satisfies these requirements. I would be happy to hear it and maybe do it instead of or in addition. But
yeah, I'm personally not wedded to dry run or audit mode, but I don't see any way to make it safe in upgraded clusters without at least one of those. And that's getting exactly to your point, John, of like, if you don't know what's going to happen until you make it into a stick, then you're going to get beaten by your own stick, and then you'll be sad.
Arvind, and then David.
Hey, thank you, folks. My name is Arvind. I work at Red Hat, and I'm representing SIG Windows here. So my only request would be, I understand it's capable, it's hard to support Windows from the get-go, but could we add some sort of requirement that states that at least Windows will not be broken as part of this?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Awesome, thank you.
I think that's probably a sub point of safe to enable in new and upgraded clusters, if we want to make that explicit there.
So
yeah, sorry, go ahead, David.
I was going to say, going back to runtime classes, do we think that a solution that doesn't coexist nicely with runtime classes is going to be one that we want to go with? And do we have boundaries around that? Things like restrictions that we'd be willing to tolerate about runtime classes or not? Because I do look at that and I say, like, if we come out with a policy that says you can't have, I don't know, you can't have a runtime class to a pod with no runtime class and one with a runtime class in the same namespace and enforce policy, like outcomes like that seem less than ideal.
I feel like that could actually work fine either way. Suppose you have a cluster that supports both the normal Linux C groups and namespaces runtime, and also some more advanced runtime like Kata containers or gvisor. Maybe you do have a use case where you would be okay with having pods with both runtime classes in the same namespace. But if you want to say within this namespace you must be using gvisor or whatever, that could be something that this sort of policy framework would enforce on if this policy framework were configurable. Or if this policy framework were focused on like the more standard container runtimes, then that would be a really simple webhook for somebody to write. And so, like, I don't feel like it is automatically necessary that this do enforce on runtime class. But if it does, I feel like it's necessary for the rest of it to be configurable.
To be clear, I'm less worried about it being able to enforce on runtime classes and more concerned about being able to write something that enforces on runtime classes that can coexist with what we have. And I think I do see the ability to have pods from multiple runtime classes in the same namespace as a useful feature when you think about trying to do things like quoting them and network policy. These things may be related and you just want to run them with different runtime classes.
I think, to me, the question here is, do we want to build into this policy mechanism the ability to either configure it separately or punch holes through for runtime classes and other things? Or do we want to say that if you're in this situation of mixing and matching runtime classes within a namespace, then we recommend you use some third-party controller?
I think our story would be a lot stronger if we have some way to coexist in the same namespace with them. And I think that if we design it that way to begin with, it may not be too difficult if we don't try to expand it and say, I want to configure and enforce on all these, and just say, if you want to do something, we'll let you and stay out of your way.
I think I agree with you. I do worry a little bit about this. If we say, okay, you can configure based on runtime classes, I worry a little about that. Kind of expanding into, okay, we're also going to let you configure based on this other field and this other field. And
yeah, I can get that. I guess what I would say is runtime classes exist today, and it's not like a theoretical thing.
I think in the end, it does come down to whether or not whatever we build is configurable. Because if we have something that's not configurable, that has like absolutely minimal configurability, like the bare minimum pod security, then that doesn't support the use case of having mixed runtime classes enforced within a namespace, because to make meaningful use of some other runtime class, you would probably want to not have opinions about a lot of the features that don't make, a lot of the pod spec fields that don't make sense under those alternate runtime classes. But I guess I would also say that if we adopted something that's that simple, where like the first word in the document is, if you have complex needs, then you should adopt something more sophisticated. Mixing runtime classes in a namespace qualifies you as being sophisticated enough that you're beyond the use case of like bare minimum pod security. But then if it was something more like the sort of PSP replacement proposal, you could have two policies bound into your namespace. One that has no opinion about any pod fields at all except for runtime class, and insists that runtime class be, say, gvisor, just for example. And another one that has, relatively restricted settings for most fields and doesn't care about runtime class. And we wouldn't have to ship pre-canned policies that touched runtime class at all. But by being able to enforce on runtime class, you could build out those two policies. And by binding both of them to a namespace, you would get the behavior that you wanted, which is you can use gvisor or you can use unprivileged pods. So yeah, I do think it comes down to how complex the adopted solution is.
Jordan had a hand for a while.
I made the mistake of trying to put together a thought and then take notes at the same time. This is not going to go well. I left some comments on Tim's bare minimum proposal. There are a few dimensions that I think make sense to allow the person running the cluster to decide to punch holes for and fall through to some other policy mechanism. So my ideal would be to allow coexistence with other more complex policy mechanisms while not adding complexity to the thing that we're maintaining. And so the simplest way I could think of to do that was to let the person running the cluster decide what to punch holes for. And the dimensions I came up with were, based on conversations that have been had so far, were namespace, user, and runtime class. I think all of those use cases are somewhat niche, but legitimate and like real existing use cases. And from a complexity perspective on the solution we provide, it's It's very simple. It's like an enumerated list. Like if it's this user or this namespace or this runtime class, assume that there's some other mechanism in place doing enforcement. But it would allow that coexistence and not break those use cases and make people re-implement their custom policy to sort of handle use cases that this solution would handle well.
Ian, next.
Sorry, turning this up. I mean, I think when we're talking about complexity, I think it's important to consider complexity for whom, though. Are we talking about complexity for us as maintainers, or are we talking about complexity for end users? Because what I hear as a desire from end users is there are certainly the people who want to have their super granular control thing and whatever we put out to be compatible with their super granular control thing. But also a lot of the demand, I think, that our proposal was trying to address was from end users who actually don't want to put a whole lot of thought into it, but who want to put something on it and want to be told what to do, you know, and saying that not giving them options, if I interpreted that correctly, leads to less complexity or more simplicity for them. I think they're asking for a different kind of simplicity than that. They're asking for, please don't make me think, please hand me this thing, you know? And I just want to point out the distinction there because I think it's important.
Kristen.
Yeah, so I just wanted, and I actually I'm parsing what Ian said and then want to maybe have a follow-up question for that. But I would say that calling the namespace user and runtime cases niche, it does not apply to the customers I talk to. I talk to a number of customers who need more than that. And so if I think about what Ian just said, I mean, yes, there are challenges with what's available today and how to, you know, make it work consistently and expected, and there's a lot to understand. And so I think Ian's right if I'm understanding that, you know, simplicity for the end user is a goal. I'd agree, but it doesn't mean they don't want these other use cases addressed. They want to be able to address those in a way that is simpler than what we offer today, but I would disagree that those are niche use cases. And that's it for me.
I'm sorry, but when you say like those use cases that you're talking about, are you talking about mixing runtime classes, or are you talking about something more general?
So I'll defer to David on the runtime classes, but I guess, for example, concretely, right, I absolutely talk to customers who want different different privileges applied to different pods in the same namespace, for example, and also by user. So those are the two that I absolutely do run into. David could probably be clearer on the runtime example than I can.
Yeah, runtime classes I see as something that is now being leveraged more often than it was before, and how you enforce on it, it brings in a whole new, it's basically impractical to build an API that's going to be configurable for different runtime classes. And I think we just have to figure out how to live in a world that has, that can delegate that authority to some different admission plugin, something like, don't mess with these runtime classes. Yeah.
And I guess that gets back to the question of simpler for who, because like a lot of these concerns are saying we're going to have something that is enforcing policy besides this, but we want to use this for some aspects of policy, and we want to use that other tool for other aspects of policy. And like, I want to discourage that. Like, even though it's possible to have two different admission controllers enforcing opinions about the same fields, it sounds like you're setting yourself up for a big usability problem. So like, I want to encourage people to turn this off if they have use cases that go beyond its capabilities, regardless of where we define those capabilities to be.
You can imagine an API that says, I want all pods here to be roughly equivalent to, I don't know, one of the things in Tim's document about the 4 classes of pods or whatever it was he had. And if you do that in a unified way, then the user doesn't have to think about anything beyond like, okay, I want this to be the equivalent to safe or default. And any admission plugin could honor that, right? And so from a user experience, it's very easy. You say, I want this namespace to be safe or green or yellow or whatever you described it. And then the individual admission plugins could enforce that on particular runtime classes. Like that's just like if I were doing it in the next 10 minutes, what could I do sort of thing. So I don't think it necessarily makes it more complicated for an end user.
When we're talking about runtime classes specifically, I think it's important to remember that the end user is not the person configuring the runtime classes. Like to set up a runtime class, you need admin privileges to create a cluster scoped resource. You need to configure the CRI runtime on the nodes themselves. So this is already like a fairly advanced administrator or provider that's providing the runtime class in the first place. And so when it comes to setting up a policy enforcement mechanism on that runtime class, I see that as something that could definitely be a part of that runtime class setup, and then kind of surfacing that to the end user. So I think I'm agreeing with what David just said based on that.
I think so, but for the purpose of this meeting, I just want to get to the point of trying to agree that it is a situation that we want to explicitly handle or explicitly not handle in some graceful way. It's just so that it's a considered design criteria, not an accident of whatever we create.
Going back to the point about complexity, like user-facing complexity, I agree that we want to avoid user-facing complexity or things that make it confusing to users. One of the things that we've seen be confusing to users is having multiple pod security policies apply and not being sure which one was going to be effective. And so solutions or proposals that talk about like binding multiple policies into a namespace and like letting like the pod is going to be handled by one of them. I worry that that's retreading the steps that we've already taken with PSP. It also just practically.
Do you think that's true if it doesn't mutate though?
Yeah, actually. Yeah. Like I regularly answer questions about, like I bound the restricted policy in, but this privileged one was also connected to the namespace. And I bound the restricted one. Why did my privileged pod get allowed? And I know part of that is due to the current authorization binding mechanism, which is really problematic. But I expect that confusion. Like I connected policy X to my namespace and policy X is not being affected. Why?
Because you bound privileged allow all at the cluster level, and so therefore nothing you do in any namespace matters. Like, I can see how that would be obvious to some users and also tremendously confusing to other users. So yeah.
It also just practically, like for dry run purposes, when multiple policies can interact, it's harder to reason about like one change in isolation. That's sort of getting into implementation, but I'm thinking in terms of like auditing and dry run. And when you have multiple things interacting, your options are more limited in terms of like how to safely be sure that like a particular change is going to do what you want, when it sort of depends on the full cluster state.
I think we can start getting into implementation.
Yeah, just a quick question, if you don't mind. So I guess I'm wondering whether we can address. I don't disagree, Jordan. I've talked to customers too, users too, who, you know, it's complex to figure out which PSP got applied and why. And I'm just want to be sure that I'm just not convinced yet that we can't address that complexity without, you know, that we have to drop some of the use cases we've been talking about in order to address that complexity. Maybe I just don't know enough. So.
Related to the stuff Jordan has said about users, namespaces, runtime classes, do we, I guess this kind of goes back to what David said. I'm still unclear on where we landed. So I guess in my head, I see user namespace and runtime class as an important, or a series of important dimensions. But do we feel that a built-in solution must handle them perfectly, or can we just provide a way to say the built-in solution can be turned off at that particular dimension, and you may then use whatever solution you want to give you more robust control at that dimension? That way you can still use it in all the other dimensions in whatever way it still works. Like, I don't think I necessarily agree with Tapta's concern about having the mixture. I don't know, I think it's too late not to have mixtures, because you can have as many admission webhooks as you want, and you get to decide what crazy is going to happen on your cluster. So I think that ship has kind of sailed already. So in that same regard, could we get to a point where we say, okay, this built-in solution, this is as far as it goes. We want to make it easy for you to layer on your external solution. It would be super awesome if your external solution handled runtime class, because we do nothing. If your runtime class isn't if it's set to anything, we can't do anything for you because we don't know what it means. But it would be super awesome if the gvisor runtime class could also honor the same label or whatever as the policy enforcer and do something good with it. We just can't enforce anything because we don't know what it means.
Are you proposing just being able to turn on or off all of the different controls? Like not just runtime class, but also like I want to implement custom policy on host network or capabilities or something like that?
No, I think I was mostly talking about those three dimensions. So like if you want user Mo to not be enforced with this policy and you have a special OPA policy for Mo, then cool. Turn it off for Mo statically somewhere, use OPA for Mo. If you have regular containers and you have gvisor containers, fine, turn it off. Well, I guess you don't have to turn it off for gvisor. We literally will do nothing for gvisor, and we will expect something else to do something reasonable with gvisor.
I wasn't proposing doing nothing for gvisor unless told by the cluster deployer too.
Oh, okay, yeah, you could frame it that way too. I was more saying that since we don't have any idea what the runtime classes properties are, I don't know what we should do, and maybe we should. So you could either assume you should do exactly the same thing, or you should assume you should do nothing. I guess either one is fine. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and going back to what Kristen said, I think I would probably agree that those use cases aren't niche, but they're not standard. Maybe that's a better way of saying that. Like, to be able to support sort of the range of things a person could want to do in response to a custom user, or things a person could want to do in response to a custom runtime class. I think we would approach like OPA or we go in terms
Thing
of
that's codable.
API surface complexity. I'm sorry, Tabitha, did you say something?
Was just trying to one up that, like something, you need something that you can write code in to be able to handle the generality of that.
Yeah, so even though those are not necessarily niche, they are not ones that we can support with a like small out of the box set of policies that sort of react correctly to the breadth of things you'd want to do there.
I would agree that a small set of policies could be challenging to do. I guess maybe how small is one of our questions. I know we're trying for 3, so at the moment.
If what Mo was saying, where something out of the box could sort of translate the out of the box is the wrong term. Something external, some custom policy could translate the intent of our default policy levels into what makes sense for that runtime class. If you have more than like 3, maybe 4, but more than 3, I think it's a stretch to get reasonable mappings in some external policy engine that apply to like a runtime class.
I think if you carefully construct the initial API and imagine just something at like a namespace level, are you going to demo something here, Jordan, in like the last 10 minutes?
I didn't pre-flight it, so I feel bad about taking time to do that.
But like if you decide at a namespace level, like I want this namespace to be green, having that description and then having a way to say on a runtime class, don't pay attention to this, then like a simple implementation could just be that everything that wants to honors the greenness of that namespace, whatever it means for a particular runtime class. It's something different for Kata than it is for gvisor versus Windows. And yet you have an API that fulfills that intent on all these different platforms, so that the end user is not faced with some complicated piece of configuration, but says, I want to be green or I want to be yellow. And the details are handled by independent people writing admission plugins that honor those common pieces.
Are you saying though that once we have green, yellow, and red, we're going to start just expecting the implementers of various runtime classes to jump on that and start implementing it? Like I guess
I'll like if I saw that, if there was a simple way to have it expressed and it was the standard from Cube of like, we do this, I kind of expect most people would want to, yeah. Because it makes...
I guess what I want to know is, if I am a user and I have a green namespace, or I make a green namespace and I'm going to do stuff in it and it's going to have like gvisor containers in it, how do I know that the runtime class will do something reasonable? Am I just going to wait long enough for this to be well supported, kind of like RBAC eventually became well supported across environments, and then I just didn't worry about it anymore?
I can imagine multiple paths from here to there, but right now, I would, let's see, off the top of my head, I'd say that if I knew I didn't have anything, a cluster admin would enforce something. And yeah, I would say that like a year after it gets introduced, support will probably be pretty decent, sort of like RBAC.
And in the interim, you can just not punch that hole for it. So, while you're waiting for the custom gvisor support, you can always just say, I still want to apply the restricted profile for gvisor pods, even though it's probably safe for them to run with higher privileges.
So what I'm hearing from all of this, though, is that the initial bucket / API has to be incredibly crisp and small, so that it is.
Or intent-based might be a better way to describe it, right? Like I intend it to be this, and there's only 3 intents. And having an API with no configuration surface area makes that doable. As soon as you add a configuration surface area, it suddenly becomes, I don't think, possible to build this because there's not going to be a consistent set of 3. But
that intent needs to be crisply defined, and I don't think we've quite achieved that today.
Yeah, I think in earlier conversations we found cases where if the pod API changes, then some users would want to honor their previous intent, thus causing their cluster to break upon upgrade time, and other users would want to honor their previous choice, thus causing their cluster to continue to work after upgrade, but losing some of their intent. And so that's where allowing them to configure things themselves, but us shipping some versioned options helps. But that kind of UI of like, this is green as of 1.24, this is green as of 1.25, is not really crisp enough for the kind of third-party intent-based uptake that you're imagining, David.
I don't know that I'd agree with that. I bet, given docs are already versioned, I bet the intent is fairly clear. Like I want what would have been good back then.
I left similar comments on Tim's bare minimum proposal. I think he had proposed a single level or 2 levels, like privileged or baseline, and proposed no versioning. I think that representing all 3 levels of pod security standards is useful. And I think that being able to express version intent is also useful. So Tabitha, you just called out like exactly the 2 classes of users. Like some users say like, I want to be green, whatever green means, and I would rather this thing be broken if there's a new control that is involved.
Because I'll figure it out when I smoke test.
Right. Like Cube added a new thing and they realized something was a gap and they closed the gap, and I would rather have the gap closed. I run my stuff in CI or whatever. And then there's the other class of user, which is like, I'm upgrading and don't you dare break me. Like audit or let me audit at that level, that's fine, but this is my only cluster. It's my only production cluster.
And this is why I proposed pushing the change between which one of those 2 intents you wanted kind of off onto the distros. So like when you upgrade your cluster, you can be like, give me the YOLO upgrade or give me the safe but outdated upgrade.
So I think it's actually better to give that power to the users. I forget who asked if I was going to demo. I actually was playing around with like different ways to maybe express this. And I liked the thing that Tim proposed, which was labeling namespaces, because it's very cube-like. You can use label selectors to query namespaces and say, like, show me namespaces that are enforcing or aren't enforcing, or enforcing at some level or not. If we add a version dimension, so you can say, I want to be restricted as of 1.7, or restricted latest. Like you can express both of those. If that is independent of like what we're enforcing or auditing or warning about, then you can do things like say, I want to be restricted as of 1.7, and I want to audit at restricted latest. That I don't think we have to go all the way to an exposed API surface to get those properties of like being able to express that intent. I don't think we have to increase the number of buckets. I think it's really just asking the user, like, okay, you want to be in this bucket. Do you want to be like pinned to the current version of that so we never ever break you? Or do you want to float to latest? That's still a much smaller surface area than like exposing all of the guts of the controls in an API.
that smaller surface area encourages people to turn the entire thing off at the time when they turn on something much fancier, which I think is another positive property.
It's also a small enough API surface area that, like, if I wanted to basically re-implement this in OPA Rego with a little bit of like custom sauce on top, I have the tools to do that. There's kind of one, something getting into the implementation details that needs more discussion is, like, we add a new field, we add an option to a field, what happens for the older profiles? Like, how exactly do we deal with those? I think Jordan and I talked about that a little bit. I don't know that we need to go into the details here. So we have 4 minutes left. I think this was a productive conversation. In terms of next steps, I set this up as a recurring meeting every 2 weeks. I think we have more to talk about, so I'd like to meet again in 2 weeks. Are there any kind of like final closing thoughts or ideas for action items over the next 2 weeks before we meet?
I think it'd be helpful to look at both of the proposed implementations with an eye towards the concepts of like punching a hole, like dimensions to punch a hole, and an external engine sort of taking the user intent expressed in each of these proposals, PSP++ or like bare minimum security policy. Like, how would an external implementer, could they ramp taking that intent and sort of layering their own sauce? Like, how hard would it be for them to do that?
Yeah, I hate to put you on the spot, but Jordan, could you add some of what you're talking about with having 3 options instead of 2 and having them versioned into the bare minimum pod security doc?
I'm happy to. I didn't want to switch from a commenter to a co-author without Tim's permission. I'm happy to hold that in. What?
You have my permission.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I also think better in code sometimes, so I actually implemented like a quick and dirty version of that just to play with and kind of see how it worked. So I'd be happy to demo that next time if we want to kind of look at the user experience side of it and think about those two, like how would you punch a hole or how would an external implementer layer on top? Okay.
Any last thoughts, or should we take a 2-minute break before our 2 p.m. meetings? Those in the Pacific time zone. All right, well, thanks everyone. If you have any other thoughts or ideas, feel free to use the mailing list or the Slack channel. Otherwise, I look forward to continuing the conversation in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody.